Well, hi everybody. Today we've got another review and we're going to be reviewing Never Binge Again by Glenn Livingstone, PhD. I know Steph has had some feelings about this book and I've had a really interesting time rereading it because this was a book that I read and really liked and had a good go at when I was
Mm.
struggling with binge eating myself. But I guess we should probably give an overview of the message of the book and what the book actually is. Is there anything you need to say off the top, Steph, to get off your chest before we start?
No, I will get it off my chest as we go.
Okay.
Do you want to go first?
Well, the premise behind the book, and he actually says this is a quote from the book. He says, in order to never binge again, you just have to never binge again. And then he says, profound, right? Question mark.
Uh-huh. Um, we can talk about the simplicity, the oversimplicity of it. We can also talk about the merits sometimes of of simplicity, not oversimplicity. The only thing like I feel like I guess maybe I do need to say is that whenever I hadn't read this book before, this isn't one that I'd come across. And the first thing that I think about when I look at the book, when I like the theme of this book to me is inner pig. And
Hmm.
that's to me what this book is. And I can't get past that. And that's largely what gets in my way, well, among other things, including oversimplicity and some other notes that I've got. But this book had such a stigma attached to it, where he essentially introduces the idea of the inner pig right away. And it clouds everything. It to me is such a fundamentally unhelpful way of talking about this. And I also want to say, like, the triggerability of that to anyone who hasn't read this book before, who might have it in their Amazon cart or something, and who, just to know that the way that he talks about the inner binger, which is actually not unlike the way Catherine Hansen talks about neurological junk. And we can talk about the similarities there. But he labels this part of us the inner pig. And he also provides caveats and says if that doesn't sit well with you, don't use it. He does sort of acknowledge in several places, this isn't how I mean it, which is nice that he acknowledges it, but you said it and it's there now. And all that's why it's like, even though he said all that, I can't, all I hear in my head is inner pig. And so I think that that might be a helpful jumping off point about like his premise about what binging is and how you get around it and what you're dealing with, which is essentially this inner pig.
Well, he also says in the introduction, because like you said, he does all the qualifiers, you can call it something else, etc., etc. But he also speaks to people like you who couldn't get past it. And this is a quote from the book. He says, if the pig analogy or this method bothers you, stop.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, you'll just leave me bad reviews.
Well, Glenn, self-fulfilling prophecy there.
But also to me, I don't know why that really irritated me. He's kind of saying, if you're not liking this book, just stop so that you cannot, almost to me, it sounded like so that you cannot justify giving me a bad review.
Yeah.
And I don't know, that kind of bothered me a bit.
I do have to say, I understand the predicament of having a tool that maybe you that helped you, which is the way that this helped him. And I sympathize with that because it's like when you've got something that's been really helpful to you and you want to share it and you've maybe shared it with other people that it's helped. It's debatable, but okay. But you also know that some people might find it to be unhelpful. It's very difficult. I know this. I mean, we know this, the way that we have to include so much nuance when we talk about something because what helps someone hurts someone else. And I appreciate that dilemma.
Can I
And
just say though,
yeah,
I'm not convinced he did use this method.
why? Do
Well,
tell.
because why wouldn't he use examples from himself? I don't understand why he wouldn't say how he came up with it, how it was developed, how he made this
Hmm.
realization. This is how I read it because I was waiting for a personal anecdote. There's one point where he talks about resisting a craving himself, but he never talks about labeling it as the pig. So I wonder if this is something he's developed afterwards.
No, he does. He doesn't give out anecdotes, but he does say, I used to be. He says, frankly, I'm a guy who couldn't stop thinking about food, even while he was working with psychotherapy patients and coaching clients. So he was working with sounds like binge eating, even as he was himself struggling with it. But then he's, so he goes on to say all the things he suffered with. And he says, I'm someone who spent most of his life feeling desperate to control food. That is until I discovered a childlike trick of mind, which got me thinking like a permanently thin person. A weird idea that got in my head and grew progressively stronger by itself. And then it goes in to describe the pig, the pig idea.
So he also suggests if the word pig bothers you so much, a couple of the examples he offers is junkyard dog. And I don't know why that makes me laugh, because to me, I don't think we have junkyard dogs in the UK. It's actually something that exists in America, that these dogs like roam these scrapyards or something. That's what I'm imagining. Is that actually a thing?
Not that I've seen, but in movies.
That's what I mean. I've seen it in movies. I don't know if it's a thing, or feral cat or something. But he said whatever it is, it kind of has to be gross. So he's not talking about a cute little piglet. It has to be undesirable. And he does say this pig obviously doesn't actually exist. He talks about it as like a psychological organization, or as you said there, like a childlike trick of the mind to label all these things that you don't want. Yeah, that's a bit of a loaded phrase anyway, as that's the pig. So he talks about the thinking that you don't want as pig squeal, the food that you feel like you shouldn't be eating as pig slop. And yeah, that's the main thing. It's pig squeal and pig slop that he jumps between, isn't it?
Yes. And it's very black and white, thinking good and bad. It's the good part of you versus the bad part of you. And it's just about discarding the bad, which is, again, what Katherine Hansen talks about in her book.
Never Binge Again.
No, that's this book.
Pray Never Binge.
Yeah, that's all I kept doing the same thing. With neurological junk. I have found the concept of neurological junk to be really useful, actually. I've integrated that into a way that I conceptualize certain things. However, I also had a problem if you go back to episode, what book review number was that? Because we review her book in episode
70 or something. I think it'd be around there.
Okay.
60. I'll have a look. Go on.
In that episode, I remember talking about the concept of neurological junk, which is helpful in a context, but also how it wasn't complete enough for me. And I think I talk about how it's a very good concept for very black and white thinkers who thrive on black and white thinking, but not for nuance. But calling it a pig is so much different than calling it neurological junk, and that delivery matters. Do you have the number?
It's number 81.
80. Good. That's close. I would have guessed like 44. But something I wrote, I took my notes on my phone, and one of the things that I wrote was, this is not unlike nervous system theory, but the delivery matters in terms of understanding primalism. You know what I mean? Like the primal urges. He's sort of looking at it like that, but she's just demonizing the primal urges as a pig or junkyard dog, which I don't think is helpful for reasons I will get to, aside from just the stigma of it. But I also wrote, this was me once, harnessing the anger and empowerment of inner pigness. So I get it. It's creating the fight response to a freeze. So there was this part of it that I related to in terms of like, I could see how the attempt is trying to be empowering. It's trying to be like, oh, this is some BS in the back of my head that's trying to get in my way. It's old. It's not part of my conscious will. And you empower yourself by fighting it. And even calling it a pig is part of creating the enemy state, right? Which really inspires fight or flighters. You know what I mean? Like, and I used to do this. I used to be like, I'm going to empower myself against my binge urges, right? And for a while, that adrenaline served me and helped me feel like I was taking control back. That's I think where it comes from. But that was a setup for such a crash and burn that I don't know many people who can continue like that, like who that's sustainable for, except maybe, and this comes up a lot of these books we're reviewing, with the exception of Katherine Hansen, are men. And I wonder if it's actually easier in some ways for some men to have more like good, bad, boom. And just to separate it this way, that I never found sustainable.
I think it's a compelling idea because it's one, like you say, it's an empowering message of you can take control over this part that you don't like. And the other part that's very compelling is it's offering you this recovery with weight loss. Because he calls the pig your fat thinking self. The pig is your fat thinking self, and you want to be your thin thinking self. And he talks a lot about becoming thin and it being about being thin. He doesn't even try and do the whole losing some losing some weight for your health kind of message. He doesn't even go in there. It's just this message. And he's quite scathing of a lot of the emotional work, working on your relationship with yourself, those kinds of things, as being anything to do with this. He says you can't love yourself thin. But again, it comes back to like this idea of thinness.
Yeah. I
So of
mean,
course it's compelling. If you're struggling with this and you're having like you've got quite poor body image or your body is of a size or functionality that is distressing to you, this is a very, very compelling idea.
I think it's pretty mainstream. I think I don't know many people who talk about binge eating recovery who don't include weight loss as part of the promise.
Mm.
But it's like he doesn't acknowledge or see that in any way. He does say, though, he talks about the idea of losing weight later. It's also one of those things like the other books we've read where it's like he says one thing in one chapter and then talks to the other side of his mouth in a different chapter. But there is one part where he does explicitly say, like, deal with this piece and then like worry about losing weight at a later time. Like if that's something that's getting in your way. When as I read that, I was like, yes, that was a helpful thing for me too. I didn't tell myself I couldn't revisit the idea of weight loss. I just couldn't do it right then. And he endorsed that in at least one part. But to get back to your original point about the simplicity, like some of the parallels he draws about how to do this. Okay, this was one of my favorites. He's like, I mean, when you think about it, it's like if you make a promise to yourself to never binge again, then that's the promise that you keep. It's like you can keep the promise of never.
Yeah, robbing a bank. That's the one. He's like, you don't have to use willpower not to rob a bank because you just don't rob banks.
Yeah. He uses these things that he's like, that's just something you already have never promised because it's like that extreme. He's like, never means never. It means there is no room whatsoever for any leniency. It's like OA, in the episode we talked about there, where it's like, you don't put one shred of anything off of your food plan in your mouth. And if you do, you fail. And you can't even let that option into your head. This is a way of really organizing black and white thinking so that you're not crossing lines and making it blurry. I understand why he's doing that. I understand the appeal, but the comparison to like, you already know how to do that because you don't rob banks. That's a never for you. Again, for many people, binging is not that straightforward. It's not like not robbing a bank. The parts that you're suggesting that we suppress and repress are actual parts. Like whether you want to think about it like parts theory or inner child, like or neurological primal nervous system drives, like however you want to name it, these are parts of us that are fighting for something. And to say like, you just don't do that because it's just bad, the way robbing a bank is considered bad, it's like, well, that is completely neglecting what the message of this part is, which is a part of self. So I think it basically sounds like you're just shutting a part of yourself in a box and telling it not to come out. And how successful is that? That is not the same as being like, don't rob a bank. Like, I just feel like you're not comparing apples to apples.
Yeah, because the other comparison he gives is you wouldn't marry someone who was like, oh, I'm 80% sure I won't cheat on you. And he uses these straw man arguments to try and make a case. But when he talks about perfectionism, this was interesting and frustrating. So he says, he acknowledges that, yes, there is a lot of research to suggest that perfectionism compounds binging. He says, but it's only a problem if you apply it retrospectively. So what he's saying is you go into it, absolutely embrace perfectionism. You're never going to binge again. And he talks about binge as one bite off your food plan as well, which again sounds very OA, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So he's like, you're never going to binge again. He says, but if you do, you shouldn't be perfectionistic about it. You should give yourself grace and you should be kind to yourself and reset, but not use that as an excuse not to be perfectionistic. So he's like, you need to pick and choose where you're a perfectionist and where you're not. And I just think for many people who have perfectionistic tendencies, it's chronic and it shows up everywhere. They can't just choose, I'm going to be perfectionistic over here and then I'm just not going to be perfectionistic over there. I don't know that a lot of people's psychology is organized that way or can be organized that way.
Well, yeah, apparently he's figured it out, and it's how he functions. And I think it's largely CBT again. You know what I mean? Like it's a cognitive based. This is right. This is wrong. This is where you do this. This is where like it's like a map for something that I don't think binge eating generally for most people has that kind of straightforward map. It's not like, okay, here you can apply perfectionism, here you can't. Here you can say never, here you can say like it's if it was so simple, wouldn't we have done this by now? I get that maybe who he's speaking to is like, I don't know, maybe there's a subset of people for whom it's really a matter of assigning consciousness to something. But I rarely ever see this. I rarely ever see somebody who would find this helpful or doable for any length of time. Maybe a bit, because it uses you can ride that wave for a while. You can do that whole like, okay, never always. Like, okay. It's like when we talked about the marshmallow test. And I was like, there's a part of me that can rally for a bit and be like, okay, I'm going to do that thing you're asking me to do. I'm going to hold on tight while I do that thing. Eventually, though, like I can't sustain that. I'm going to start questioning it. I'm going to start getting bored, and that's something that's not about willpower, although I think he's suggesting it is.
Mm-hmm. So just to clarify the method a little bit, because we've touched on the pig, but the idea is that you make your own food plan and you make your own food rules. So it's really about embracing food rules. He does a few times say this is not suitable for people with eating disorders such as anorexia and bulimia, but binge eating disorder gets completely left out because, as we know, it is dismissed by so many professionals and people in general as somehow a less problematic or just a less than eating disorder, which just drives me crazy anyway. So you set your own food rules and then you stick to them. And you put these rules in place to make your eating look the way that you want it to look. And any thought or argument that comes into your head to try to get you to break a rule, you label that as pig squeal. And he says that to have nevers and always and then conditional. So never might be, I'm never ever going to eat chocolate again, no matter what. Always might be, I will always eat a piece of fruit or whatever before I have my dinner or something like that. And the conditionals might be, oh, I can have chocolate once a week, but they have to be really clear, black and white, zero wiggle room, because he says your pig will always try and wiggle its way out. So the types of foods that you are trying to either stop eating or only eat conditionally is all pig slop. Well, how the book is also set up is he explains the method and then he goes through all the resistance that you might have to it. And the resistance that he brings up is basically kind of things that you and I are already talking about. So I just wanted to say, like this, if he were to listen to us reviewing this, this is what we would sound like to him. Because and that again really got my back up because I heard that as any kind of critical thinking against this method that I'm saying is what people need to do is pig squeal. It discourages critical thinking and that pisses me off.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. That's a great way to put it.
Oh, you're welcome.
That's a great way. I think he's assuming that pig squeal is weakness. It's like, oh, but I really want and look, one of the things I wrote, I said, sometimes firm confidence and strong boundaries are helpful. I think there are places where even my own life where I could in certain areas use okay, where I need sort of that voice in the fear self-compassion. It's like the voice in my head that's kind of like, no. We're gonna do this for ourselves, or we're not gonna do this. That's helpful. But a lot of the reasons that I had pig squeals was actually part of the things I'm glad I have. Like the critical thinking skills, or the part of me that's like, this is like you telling me what to do and me just like blindly being like, yes, sir, yes, sir. Like that part of my thinking process is something that, it's like discouraging the buts. And it's like, there's a reason why those criticisms come up. There's a reason why those pig squeals come up, because maybe it's a self-advocacy. Maybe there's something about it that's saying like, actually, this doesn't feel right to me, or actually, this isn't going to be sustainable for me. And actually, you're furthering my perfectionism. And that's actually part of the reason I have binge eating disorder in the first place.
I think as well, I just wanted to go in and look at the reviews, because you know how on Amazon they do the top positive review and then the top critical review. The top positive review, I won't read it all out because it's quite long, but this is the top one. It says, I've waited 3 weeks before writing this review. In those 3 weeks, I have, for the first time in my life, stuck to the food rules I've always wanted to live by. I've had very few cravings and none I couldn't quickly squash. 3 weeks, guys.
Yeah.
3 weeks.
How long ago was that?
Actually, no, tell a lie. No, to be fair, this was 2017. To be fair, there is an update. They've updated it. It's now 10 weeks since, and I'm easily sticking to the food plan. So 10 weeks we've got there, which again, you know, maybe that's someone for whom it has helped, because to say this has never helped a single person or worked for a single person is probably
right.
realistic. This one, again, it doesn't really comment on the method. It's more about the book. It says, as others have said, this is a very different book to any other binge eating book. I'm sure it works for some, but so far not for me. In fact, it made me binge even more in preparation for not binging anymore. Thank you.
Yeah.
Personally, I feel addressing the psychology of why I binge is a much more powerful tool. The deprivation worksheet is a helpful exercise, and I think there are some useful concepts and good supporting materials on the website. Overall, the tone is patronizing and childish.
Yeah.
Terribly written, and the typography is not really a big thing. So it's always going to be, I think, the kind of book that's a bit like Marmite. But what was really interesting for me was going into my Kindle and seeing the passages that I highlighted when I was struggling. So the bits that I would have highlighted back then. And it's interesting because the first one I highlighted, I thought, yeah. And even now, it can feel a certain way for me. So this was what binge eating Sarah, highlighted this passage in Never Binge Again. And it is, when you care enough, tolerating any level of discomfort forever is suddenly within your power, no matter how strong a craving the pig might throw at you. And of course I highlighted that because for the longest time I thought I clearly didn't want this enough. I wasn't trying hard enough. And so there was something about thinking I need to hold on to this idea, this concept. And then just another one that I've highlighted that probably won't surprise you when you hear it. You'll go like, oh yeah, that's Sarah as well. Is just, you don't have to worry about later, only the present. And it is always the present. He says, all you have to do to never binge again is to never binge now. Right. And I remember when I first read that, I thought, this is the life-changing thing that I've read that's going to change everything from this moment onwards for me. I mean,
because it makes so much sense.
But it fed into like all these things that I was really feeling and believing at the time. And I am, big on it's only now, of course. And it's not that simple.
This is an important point too. I never read this book to begin with, but I have things like that where I'll find old things I've read or something, and the notes I took on it, and the things that I pulled from it, and I'm like, oh, I wasn't wrong. Like the parts that were resonating with me still appeal at times to some part of myself, right? Like the reason those things feel, well, especially the latter one, feels like, it's kind of like, there's still a part of you that can get on board with that idea because it's in your executive functioning. It's in the part of your brain that maybe now you have access to. But this is what makes it dangerous, I think, because the things that I was clinging on to were the things that I was shaming myself for not being able to do, or the ideas that I was like, why can't you remember this? This is actually something of your integrity that it's speaking to. And I can do it now. Like now I have access to a lot of the things that I wished I had access to before. I can use a lot of concepts now that I couldn't use before. It misses something that comes before it. It's like there's stages almost to being able to recovery. And if the I'm going to talk about like safety layer. If the safety layer isn't there, you're not able to address the things on top. And then you're kicking yourself for not being able to address those things on top because logically you're like, that makes sense though that this thing on top should apply. It is logical. Why can't I get there? And it's like, because if you're trying to get here and you don't have here, then all you're going to do is feel bad for not being able to get there, because this is the part that's not getting addressed. And I feel like what this book does, and many other books like it, is it discards that part. It calls that safety layer pig squeal. And then you can't access this part. I think some things, and there's some notes I have where I put green check marks where I'm kind of like, this part I get, this part I get, this part I get, but I couldn't get it before. And I can only get it now. But the reason I can get it now is because I had that other layer in between. Without that layer in between, I couldn't get here. And that's what's it's almost gaslighty. It's like it sounds right. It is in some degree, but only with the missing layer. And that feels so important. Yeah, I keep doing that.
Well, there's this whole idea that's in his book. It's in Brain Over Binge, and it's this separating yourself from these thoughts or feelings about food. This is separation. And
yeah,
because he says, when it comes down to it, either you or the pig is going to suffer, and it's not going to be you, he says.
Right.
So this idea of, again, splitting from that is very compelling, and I can see how that organizational psychology, oh no, that's already a thing, but your psychology being organized in that way can be helpful. But for me, I actually had to stop rejecting that part.
Right.
My interest and personal experience with parts work is about bringing all those parts in closer so that I can gently negotiate it and I can look after that part who may experience stronger cravings for all kinds of reasons that aren't necessarily about hunger.
Yeah, I want to contextualize this a little bit. Maybe like even thinking about what he calls pig squeals and what the squeals are, and maybe speaking to them with specifics. Because I'm thinking about, okay, if I'd read this book back then, I would have identified with it, and I would have been like, it would have totally appealed to my inner fighter, and it would have been like, yeah, I'm empowering myself against my inner binger, and I can feel it. What I would have had to do to sustain that is to minimize or call pig on my inner, let's say, restrictor. Like, because or sorry, not my own. I would have had to favor my inner restrictor. Now, to be fair, he talks about making your meal plan, which is very OA, right? Like this is your meal plan, this is what it is, it doesn't change. If you want to change it, by the way, you have to like go to a lawyer and get it notarized. Like you have to write it down. It's a very formal thing you have to do if you want to change your meal plan. And the purpose of that is to keep it that there's no room for gray area. But he also does say, make sure that meal plan is not restrictive. He does enforce that a bunch of times. I put a green check on that. He's like, you have to really have a meal plan that's sustainable. The problem is that I would have created a meal plan that is sustainable to my, again, where I am now, what I need to eat in a day now, because it would have looked reasonable. But it wasn't for the part of me that had restricted for so many years that needed more food than that, right? So it's like the part that I would call pig squeal was actually the part of me that was like, I actually need more food than this. But my logical mind could not have seen that. But that pig squeal was actually what saved me. And that's why I recovered at all, is because I actually listened to that part of me that was like, I need more food. And I understand that people I'm a binge restrictor, and that matters. And somebody who's identifies more as permissive is going to not necessarily have that. That's not always even the case, though, because mental restriction counts. But I think there's a great number of binge eaters who are having what we would call pig squeals that are coming from the part of us that's actually fighting for ourselves. That's like, actually, what it looks like a reasonable amount of food that is, dictated by not even just diet culture, but just regular like just what looks appropriate. It wasn't like, it just wasn't for me. And that would have never become part of my food plan.
Well, I'm in the Facebook group for Never Binge Again, and I lurk. I'm a lurker in the Facebook group. And what I have seen in there repeatedly with people's posts when they're sharing their food plans is that it's incredibly restrictive. And occasionally someone is responding to them and saying, not someone official, like another group member saying, maybe you might want to eat a bit more. But he also says that he would bet, I think he says his left kidney, yes, which is the one he's most fond of, by the way, which he's
Ha
got
ha
some,
ha 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 ha.
yeah. Um, he would bet his left kidney that anyone reading this knows what a healthy food plan is. And I thought, I used to say the same thing.
Yeah.
Even when I first started working with this, I used to say, you know enough about nutrition to know what you need. And actually, with working with people, and even actually a bit with myself too, realizing that that isn't actually true so often because of diet culture, because of even just this idea of portion control or whatever it might be, how other people might be eating in public, all of these things, I think lead us to not have a clear idea about
Yeah.
what is
Totally.
enough.
I mean, more often than not, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's huge because then you're going to be fighting biology, and then it's not about willpower. Like, in fact, he goes on to say that addiction is poppycock. He says addiction is poppycock. It's really all about it's really all about
he
willpower.
Did. Yes.
Which is freaking ridiculous. It's like, do not. I get mad.
Talking
I'm
about
like,
not just food. Sorry, I just want to clarify for
Yeah.
the listener. He's not just talking about food, all
Right.
addictions, like
All
alcohol,
addictions.
drugs, the lot.
Yeah.
You can mind over matter that stuff.
That's all I need to know about his philosophy. Like, if you are seriously minimizing cellular, like physiological urges that have so much complexity we don't even know about, we don't even, that is the kind of oversimplification I don't trust, and it's like, I would be sitting here, I just know I would have been fighting my hunger, and let alone psychology. And to minimize that into like, oh, you're just giving into your pig squeals, how shamey, and how like it's just set up to me. I'm trying to think of what other of my pig squeals would have been. What about if somebody comes over and brings, I don't know, some coffee cake? Does this ever really happen in real life anymore? I feel like it used to happen to my grandma.
People used to bring cakes around.
My grandma's friend used to come over, literally, Pauline used to come over and bring coffee cake, and they would sit there and have coffee. It was the cutest thing. I don't think it happens anymore. But my friend has come over before with like some cupcakes from this place, Mr. Cupcakes, which closed down. It was the best. But like these kind of situations that bring up like, ooh, cupcakes aren't on my food plan. It's part of the context of this communal eating. Okay, I understand that, like, maybe he's saying, look, that's the price you have to pay for recovery. It's the same way that an alcoholic doesn't go to a bar. Like, there's just going to be certain things that you can't do, except that you can. And like, I would be like, no, friend, take your cupcakes. And then my friend would go, and then I'd be like, and then the part of my pig school would be like, that doesn't seem, like I feel like I missed out on the connection there, or that just feels like a little bit of a punishment, and I wouldn't be wrong. And that part of me is supposed to like, shut up, you know what I mean? Or like inner child, that's kind of like, oh, and I understand that his point is like, oh well, oh well is it. It's kind of like, you don't have room to feel any of those nuances. Fair enough. I think that there's some people who may be like, okay, I can get behind that in a really rigid way, and this is just the way I'm going to have to lead my life. Maybe that can work when you've got really firm boundaries and you also don't apply any sense of wanting anything else. But I feel like I'm glad that I can eat a cupcake with my friend now, because I can, and I would have thought I couldn't.
Well, he would talk about it as, by not having the cupcake, you are choosing freedom. It's the same principle as well in the 12 steps, is this idea of, you're not deprived, this is how you feel free. So he talks about the difference between having the food is giving you like a cheap high, but not having the food will give you long-term contentment. This is where he pulls those two. He also says that, although he disagrees with the addiction thing, he does say that there's a tolerance going on around food, that you'll need more and more to get the same high. And I thought, no, I don't think I agree with that.
Like the dopamine?
Well, I understood it as more, okay, maybe the first year you're binging, your binges are smaller, but your binges will just get bigger and more chaotic. It would just escalate. which in theory it can't with food. There like hits a point where it's biologically impossible. I was going to move on to he's a big fan of the scale, and that by not weighing yourself, you are giving your power to the scale. And his example, his straw man argument for why you should weigh yourself, he says you wouldn't drive down the street without looking at your speed.
I love where he decides to make comparisons. Like, that's not the same.
The difference between getting a fine and points on your license and knowing how much gravitational pull is being acted upon your mass. But he really does. There's a whole chapter on the scale and the importance of it. And he suggests every day, because he says that's the whole point, is that you can keep recalibrating. And
Let's look at that differently. Like, that's a good theory. What actually happens when we do that? What are the other factors that come into play that interrupt that? And I understand his whole point is to say, don't let them. But that is like saying that psychology is not a science and that your biology is irrelevant. This is, I think, potentially one of my biggest premises in general, is that your biology and your psychology absolutely matter. And that doesn't mean that we have to be victims to every whim of our psychology and every push-pull, but understanding their influence and their place and respecting that. I don't understand how you could ignore. I can't fathom that wouldn't be a consideration. And I feel like that even in this scale argument, it's kind of like, okay, but if you weigh yourself and find yourself to be over the amount that you want to be, well, now you're going to invite shame, probably for a lot of people. Fear.
Just don't invite the shame. Don't invite the fear.
Right.
Just be rational about it.
This is like saying, yes, essentially, it's like, just never binge again. That's not help. He is going the angle of like simple, straightforward boundaries and willpower. That's not new. That is not groundbreaking science. The reason we don't do that and that doesn't work is because there are all these other factors that start to come in that are a complexity of us. And you can't just pretend those things aren't there. Maybe he could. I don't know. Maybe some, I can't. I cannot. I couldn't if I tried. I could for a little while, I can for a little while. And then I can't. But not because I don't think I'm weak for that. It's because I'm human. It's part of, I want that. I want complexity. I want to think. I want to feel. I want to have parts. I want to be nuanced. Please don't tell me to like shut myself up in a closet and become some kind of robot. So, I think there's a different way to do it. I don't think it's a choice of like, you either be a robot or you binge forever. My feeling is no, there's other ways to do this. You don't have to choose between those two.
Yes. The middle ground. And also the amount of times I had got on the scales, maybe been pleased, maybe not been pleased, but not felt like it really affected me that much. But then later on, it really did affect my eating. And I thought, well, the only thing I can think of is me getting on the scales that day. So sometimes I felt like I was in quite a rational, pragmatic place about it. But my behavior might suggest otherwise. And we can only, it's more than that even, but there's so much outside of our conscious awareness that's acting on us psychologically and emotionally as well.
Yeah.
And then behaviorally.
Yeah. I think what he's putting out there, again, to speak back to that layered thing, is like, if you could do everything he was saying the way he's suggesting that you do it, you'd have to be super regulated to do that. But I would venture to guess that most people struggling with binge eating aren't. That's kind of the implication. And that's the layer. It's like, you can't just step on a scale and take the information and like apply it in the ways that he's suggesting you apply it and keep a level head. It's like, that's exactly, if we were there, we probably wouldn't be here. He's missing a layer. Do you think there are people who binge eat and or other and just have regulation inside of them just by nature?
I think there are people for whom it might be more quickly accessible.
Yeah.
I think binging is a type of dysregulation, so they're certainly capable of being dysregulated, but there are people who could maybe read a book like this and feel really regulated by the message. So perhaps it's a little bit closer because they can regulate cognitively.
Yeah. Good point.
Like a top-down regulation compared
Yeah.
to a bottom-up regulation.
That's a great point. I want to look
Thank
into
you.
that. Like people who are top-down regulators.
Mhm.
I'm not.
I am, I think. If I work on my
Really?
beliefs and I go through my thoughts and I label and I make sense of it in my mind, I feel
Huh.
it go down into my body.
Oh, my body rules the day. Even though I love to think, and I do a lot, but what's happening in here is gonna infiltrate
Yeah.
everything else.
Which is not to say I've never had it the other way around, of
Yeah.
course, but I can find through
Hmm.
my thinking, I tend to most of the time be able to
Hmm.
bring myself into kind of
Okay.
groundedness and
Then maybe he's
centeredness
appealing
place.
to, but clearly you didn't, this book didn't work for you either. So it can't just be about that.
Well, no, because I think that the mental message is garbage. So when I'm talking about it, I'm thinking about when I am all agitated or something's going on. I don't really know what's going on, but I'm agitated and I'm craving and I'm in this kind of place. It's like the whole Rallick method that I present in my book. It is a cognitive message. I sit down and I name and I label and I go through what's going on and I'm able to identify it. And then I go through each piece and see if I can realize the benefits of accepting it. So it's always this choice as I go through. So it is very much using my thinking, but it's also being in my body, but it's my thoughts that are bringing or even questioning my thoughts, or more like observing maybe, but it is more up in my head and then coming down.
Hmm. I can do that, I think, in certain places, but in others, the thoughts, the logic is like, pfft, that's not the problem or something.
Yeah.
Something's going on here. That's the problem.
Yeah. Well, I've been going through some stuff recently with my dad, and there have been quite a few occasions where I've sat and I've worked through what I'm believing, and I'm able to like mentally choosing to let it all go. And I feel that release and that peace in my body. I mean, I've picked it back up today and I'm kind of enjoying holding it. I'm not ready to put it down. I'm not ready to accept. I kind of want to be annoyed. So I'm
Yeah.
just letting myself have that. Because if you're a top down regulator, I think it is easy to go into like an avoidance type thing
Yeah.
instead of really going into and that allowing. It can be a bit like trying to talk yourself out of something. So that's the risk when it's not really,
So
when you're not
interesting.
really connected to the experience as well.
That's interesting. I wonder if that's why, like, when I get dysregulated like that, the only thing, it's not true. If I use thoughts, it is helpful to a degree, but not enough when I'm at a certain level. But what is like being squeezed.
Mhm.
Like if I'm like, Mike, please squeeze me or like sit on me or like massage me, or sometimes like just putting me, that will just, it will offer me some kind of clarity that I cannot find anywhere else. It's physical. It's like magic sometimes.
It's like your reset button or something. It's like, oh,
It is
Stefanie's
like,
resetting. Who's going to
yes.
squeeze her today?
The other day, I forget if it was my daughter or Mike who was like pressing here. It's for the benefit of non-YouTubers, like just on the pressure point, I guess, but on my, like where the eyebrows begin. If somebody just does that, everything changes. And then I'm like, oh, oh, like
Next time I see you, I'm not even going to hug you. I'm just going to come up and stick my fingers on your eyebrows.
everything will change. I will be like,
Now I know you've given me the keys to the kingdom. Anyway, so in summary, I don't think we are much of a fan. Fair to say?
yeah. He also talks about you should put some kale in a blender with water. Did you like that
I
part?
don't remember that bit.
Because if your always, if you always have to have kale or greens every day, you could just put them in a blender with water and chug it. That's how you stick to your food plan. Just
Okay,
thought
gotcha.
that was a part we didn't touch on, but
Well, the interesting thing is because when Steph and I agreed to review this book, I said to Steph, it's not a bad one. I don't think it's great, but my memory of it was so different to when I listened to it again now. I remember it as kind of, yeah, it kind of goes along with the black and white thinking. I think I remembered it feeling more like Brain Over Binge. And when I was listening to it, I found myself getting really annoyed, but also quite shocked that all this stuff would have just been going right over my head at the time. And just goes to show how far my thinking has changed. since then. But
I would like to just close with my final note on the book. I wrote, essentially, this book is trying to empower your higher brain thinking, which is not the worst thing in the world. But primal brain is not always the enemy. Primal brain can be protection. You're demonizing a part of yourself by doing this. It might work for a time, but it runs out because it is not rooted in wholeness.